One of my most favorite things to do is going and just chilling on the roof. And I'm doing exactly that for this episode. And right now, when I'm sitting here, I can see the clear blue Bangalore sky. And this is probably the most relaxing and peaceful setting that I could have possibly been in. And on that note, let's talk about stress. Welcome back, guys. This is episode number 7 of Calm India. And in this episode, we will learn the science of stress. We are going to deconstruct it, dive deeper into how stress interacts with our body through our nervous system. We are also going to see the relationship between stress, anxiety, and depression. So let's get this started. Now, everyone, like I mentioned before, experiences stress at some point of time or the other. But the difference between someone who has a disorder and someone who does not is that normally you would experience stress as a momentary reaction to a particular situation. In case of anxiety, anxiety becomes a response to that stress, and long-term anxiety in itself leads to depression. Now, regardless of whether it's a good time or a bad time, almost everyone reports that stress interferes with their life. Usually you can get stressed by either minor sources or major sources. For instance, on one hand we have routine stress, the stress that you might get from your daily responsibilities, school work, office work, whatever homework that you have. And on the other hand, we have major traumatic events like if you end up losing a job or going through a divorce, so on and so forth. It's important at this stage for us to see not just stress as some mental set of feelings, but actually go to the physical root of stress. And for this, we are going to visit a part of our nervous system which controls all the involuntary functions. By involuntary functions, I mean those which you don't have a direct control over. For example, breathing, blood circulation, heartbeat, digestion. All of these are controlled by what is known as the autonomic nervous system or the autonomous nervous system. Now, the interesting thing about this part of the nervous system is that there's this little boxing match happening constantly. Within the autonomic nervous system, there are two parts. On one hand, we have PNS or the parasympathetic nervous system. On the other hand, we have the SNS or the sympathetic nervous system. At any given point of time, your body can only be having one of them working. Either it's PNS or it's SNS. In this match that's going on, we are on the side of PNS because PNS is responsible for acting when your body is calm, controlled, relaxed, and it regulates some of the most important and basic functions. Two of which are your blood circulation and your digestion. Sympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, is what is responsible for the fight or flight response that we've spoken about. Every time your body feels like it's in an emergency situation, the SNS starts acting. Every time your body's in a calm state of mind, your PNS is acting. We are going to find out how this fundamental rule, the fact that only one of them can work at a point of time, completely changes how stress affects our health. In the description below, we've put a comparison chart of how your body and which functions of your body work in what manner when the PNS and the SNS are acting. For our purposes, for the purpose of this episode and video, let's focus on the 4 major components. Your general body response, your gastrointestinal, which is your stomach and secretions, cardiovascular, heart rate, and musculoskeletal, which is your muscles. When the PNS is acting, your general body response is to loosen up. Your entire body goes into a state of calm. In case of SNS, your entire body tenses up and it tends to speed up more. As for gastrointestinal, the moment you have SNS acting, which is the emergency system, your gastrointestinal receives less energy and blood and it gets compromised, which is why when you have a lot of stress, you might end up having stomach problems also. On the other hand, when the PNS is acting, your stomach is working in the most ideal conditions possible. cardiovascular, that is, your heart. In the presence of PNS, your heart rate is slower. In the presence of SNS, your heart rate is higher. Finally, your muscles. In the presence of PNS, muscles tend to relax and loosen up. In the presence of SNS, your muscles contract and get ready to deploy short bursts, which is what is used for fight or flight. In order for us to understand how stress has all of these physical symptoms, we need to understand that stress is what starts the SNS, the sympathetic nervous system. And because this is supposed to be your body's response to an emergency situation, it works really, really fast. The moment your body perceives an emergency, the SNS kicks in and it starts doing its work. To understand why this happens and what actually happens inside it, let's go back a few million years ago again and imagine one of your ancestors. Imagine you are walking through a forest and you're just hunting for berries and bananas and whatever it is that you like. And all of a sudden, there's a bear that attacks you. Now, what you do in the next few seconds is going to determine whether you live or you die. So your body immediately goes into emergency mode and it releases these two special commandos inside your body: adrenaline and cortisol. What adrenaline does is that it increases your heart rate, which means that your blood is pumping faster. And it provides your muscles the mechanisms through which they work faster and harder. On the other hand, we have cortisol, which goes to your cells and tells them to release all of the glucose and energy. This glucose, which is now inside the blood, gets pumped really fast into the muscles. Now you have a clear option. You can either fight the bear, you can take a spear and hurl it at him and actually do that, or you can choose to run away really, really fast. And because your muscles are going to work at almost superhuman speed as compared to your normal performance, you will be able to escape. The thing is, out of these two, adrenaline comes really quickly and goes away really quickly as well. And by the end of this affair, whether you've escaped or you fought, your muscles are going to be really sore. They are going to be torn in places. They are going to be inflamed and swollen up in places. Which is why cortisol, which happens to be a really multi-talented guy, not only helps you in that emergency situation, but sticks around after it has finished to heal these muscles, to reduce all the swelling. After a point of time, to control this cortisol, to make sure it goes away, your body sends in insulin. Once that comes, your cortisol responds, or your cortisol just goes away slowly. This is a typically healthy response. The problem is when cortisol keeps sticking around. And again, this dynamic between cortisol and insulin we are going to explore very soon. This is why cortisol is known as the stress hormone. But nonetheless, because cortisol is this very multi-talented guy, your body actually calls it for a lot of daily functions as well. In fact, the moment you wake up in the morning, within about half an hour of waking up, cortisol levels are the highest in your body. What this does is it gives you this little kick in the morning which helps you to wake up. Progressively, that cortisol keeps reducing every single time. It spikes a little bit when you eat your meals, and then overall, by the end of the day, it goes to its most minimum level. And after that happens, you go into a deep and restful sleep. The problem arises when there's way too much stress in your body, and even after the stress has gone down, there's still a lot of it left. That's what we're going to explore now. What is it exactly that too much stress does to your body? There's a number of things that it does, and that's what we're going to discuss now. Effects of excessive cortisol. Diabetes. As you might remember, cortisol is supposed to be released in perceived emergency situations. At this point of time, your body would need a lot of glucose. And cortisol it employs mechanisms through which your body releases all the extra glucose that it can possibly collect. This glucose goes to your muscles and you can either fight or you can run away from your emergency situation. Now, in that particular situation, it's fine. But elevated cortisol levels constantly due to excessive stress mean that your blood glucose level, your blood sugar level is also elevated all the time. This is obviously very unhealthy and sets the stage for diabetes. On top of which, you might remember that cortisol is balanced by insulin. So when there's too much sugar in your blood, the body sends in insulin, and insulin tends to help the reabsorption of sugar. Now the problem is there is way too much cortisol here, and your body just might end up sending this much, and it'll realize that things are not working because the effect of cortisol is higher due to its volume. It tries to pump up more insulin. This might balance things out a few times, but your pancreas, which is where insulin is produced, cannot keep up with this for a very long time, and the effects are going to reduce again. Over a period of time, this means that your blood sugar levels remain consistently high. This can lead to type 2 diabetes. Weight gain. Using the same mechanism, the whole blood sugar and insulin problem, your cells essentially are starved of the glucose that they were actually supposed to be using. Your body thinks it's an emergency and all the glucose is flying around in the wrong places. Your cells are still waiting for all of that energy to do all of their functions. One of the ways that they can cry out for extra sugar is by sending your brain hunger signals. Now, when your brain receives these hunger signals, it'll start pushing you to overeat. To compound this problem, you usually end up seeking very high calorie foods. To compound this problem even more, cortisol tends to displace fat from different parts of your body and mobilize them into settling into your abdomen. This gives you an even more out of shape look. As you might remember, we mentioned how there's always this boxing match happening between your parasympathetic nervous system, PNS, and your sympathetic nervous system, SNS. At any given point of time, only one of these two can be properly acting. When there's too much cortisol, only your SNS is acting. The issue is some of your very basic body functions, and for this example, your digestive system, your gastrointestinal system is regulated by your PNS. Now just imagine, in a stress-filled, cortisol-flooded body, every time you want to actually digest food, you still have your SNS primarily working, and your PNS is not able to regulate and give your digestive systems the energy, the production of enzymes that it actually needs. This leads to indigestion and ulcers. You might find that times when you're really stressed out, you also have an upset stomach. The worst part is, because of these imbalances, there might be some amount of inflammation that develops in your stomach lining. And what happens when you have inflammation? More cortisol that gets flooded into your body, and this cycle continues. Cardiovascular diseases. One of the effects of alcohol is to increase the amount of blood pressure. In an emergency situation, this is really helpful because a lot of oxygenated blood and a lot of glucose-filled blood is reaching your muscles, and you can either fight or you can run away. On a day-to-day basis, however, if you have a lot of cortisol and high blood pressure all the time, that's obviously extremely unhealthy. One of the really risky effects of this is the fact that to increase blood pressure, what happens is that cortisol constricts your arteries so that blood is pumping through them. The problem is, at the edges of these arteries, there might be a buildup of plaque, or just think of it as dirt. And this can cause blockages, which in turn puts you at a very high risk of getting heart attacks. You remember those old Bollywood movies where the really angry father would just end up getting a heart attack? It might actually be a little bit medically accurate. Sleep disruption. Your cortisol levels are very intimately linked with your circadian rhythm. Your circadian rhythm is what regulates your sleeping and waking up, and how energetic and wakeful you feel throughout the day. The problem is, if there's too much cortisol, it can completely destabilize how you sleep. Remember how at the beginning of the day when you wake up, cortisol is highest, and then it gradually decreases at the end of the day before you sleep, so that you can have a deep and restful sleep. This is the normal situation. But if you have way too much cortisol, you might end up having a lot of cortisol even right before you go to sleep. And that's one of the worst things which you can do to get good sleep. It completely disrupts your sleep cycle. Unfortunately, when the next day you wake up, you're going to feel fatigued and in turn probably more stressful, which will in turn cause you to sleep less. And this can be a very deadly cycle.